Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Salesforce Admin's webinar, Decoding Triggers for Admins. My name is Mark Baseman, and I am joined by Kieran Jameson, who is the Senior Manager of Trailhead Content Engineering. Today is going to be a fantastic webinar. Of course, no webinar would be complete without our famous forward-looking statement. Please make your purchasing decisions only on products and services that are currently available. We may be talking about some future features today. Please connect with us. We are on all of the social medias. So you can find us on Twitter at Salesforce Admin, no I. You can also connect with us using the hashtag AwesomeAdmin. We are on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube as Salesforce Admin. And of course, we have a fantastic website, admin.salesforce.com. And yes, this webinar is being recorded. The video will be posted to YouTube and the webinar recap page. So keep your eyes open for the recording. If you have questions throughout the webinar today, please join the admin webinar group in the Trailblazer community. The URL is right here. You don't have to wait until the end of the webinar to ask your question. You can ask it during the webinar. If we don't get to your question during the webinar today, that is okay. We will be in the community and we will do our best to answer that question. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kieran for the rest of the webinar.
Still on?
Take it away.
Okay, great. Sorry, Mark, you cut out there for a second, so I don't know where we're at, but I'm going to just dive right in and say I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, and that's coding for admins. Today we're going to talk about triggers, what they are, how they're structured, including some of the differences between before and after triggers, where all this code lives. I'll show you some best practices so that you can check it out when you get back to your org. And we'll see a trigger in action. And then there will be time at the end for some Q&A, and I'll leave you with some resources. So let's dive in. So the first question that you should ask yourself is, as an admin, why do I care about triggers? Well, I don't know about you, but when I'm troubleshooting something odd that's going on in my org, there's nothing more frustrating than not knowing what some piece of my org is doing and how it fits together. So if you're using triggers, you need to know what they do so that you can fix them if something goes wrong. And even if you never want to learn to code full time, if you work with developers, it's really important to be able to speak the same language as they do. And it's also very important to recognize if there are if there's any code in your org that's not using best practices so that you can work with your developers to work on them. But let's look at what triggers are. Triggers are basically a type of file that contains code. It's just a file, and this code fires off other processes when we change data in Salesforce. And the whole purpose of a trigger is to wait around and listen for fun stuff to happen within your org, and they're very excitable. So when a person or a process makes a change to your data, they leap up and they're like, "Oh, I know what to do. You just updated an account record. I'm going to run this little piece of code on all the records that you just updated." So now that we know what triggers basically are, let's look at why you would use them or when you would use them. So you can use triggers to do all sorts of things. You can use them to compare data in the record before you made the change to after you make the change, and depending on the results of that, perform some kind of series of actions. You can also use them to create new or update existing records based on the records that you just updated or inserted into your org. You can also use them to create or update unrelated records, and maybe in your org or outside in some external system, maybe an ERP or something like that. You can also use them to clean up data by deleting records. And lastly, you can use triggers to interact with external databases or web services. So for example, You could use a trigger to sync data between systems inside of Salesforce and outside. You could send text messages, or the list is endless of the things that you can do with triggers. So we have a taste of what you can do. Let's talk about some specifics about how they work. There are two basic times that a trigger can fire, either before the data is committed, which is just a fancy way of saying saved, to your org, or afterwards. So within your trigger, you're going to have a section for the before save actions and the after save actions. So before triggers are great for changing data programmatically before you save the record. You can also use them to ensure that the data that you're about to enter isn't going to mess something up in your org. So basically validating the way the data that you're working on. It's great because unlike validation rules, that have limitations, your triggers can validate based on any data within your org or even with external systems. They are very, very powerful. And then after triggers, like the one that we'll see later on in my demo, are great for doing something related to the records that you just inserted or updated into your org. So for example, if you're trying to create a series of related records, then you can do that really easily with a trigger. So I'm a visual person. I'm sure that there's some of you out there who are visual. So let's look at this in a different way. Imagine that we start with some change that's made to the records in your Salesforce org. Now, a trigger is always tied to a single object. So if, for example, you clicked the new contact record, there's a trigger associated with that contact record, then the trigger will fire. And within the trigger, and it's always best practices to have just one trigger per object, then you'll likely have a few sections in it that relate to what you're going to do before and after the record is saved. So first, the before trigger actions will fire, running various pieces of code saved in a different kind of file called a class. So now we have a trigger file and we have a class file. So the trigger calls out to the class and says, hey, I want you to do some stuff. And it does its work. It validates data. It compares values before and after the change is made. It updates the data that it's about to be saved. And then your data is saved in your org. So the next thing that happens is the after trigger actions call out to more classes. So they're going to just reference more classes, which again is just a type of file, which will do all sorts of things like create related records and find other records and do something with them, all based on the IDs for the records that you just saved. Then the trigger sits back and just waits for something else to happen with the contact org. So now let's look at the way that triggers are structured. So first you're going to define the type of file. So you're using that keyword trigger to say that. So that's what that trigger word is. And then you name the file. So you're giving the file, the trigger, a name. Next, you define which objects the trigger should listen to. And then between the parentheses, you're going to define when you want this part of the trigger to run. Lastly, inside the curly braces, you'll place all of the links to the classes that you want the trigger to run. So this becomes your table of contents in a way. And so down the second section there, I have a trigger that is very similar to one that we're going to run later on. So you can see that it says trigger. It's called recipe, so that's the name of the trigger. It's working on a recipe custom object. It's going to look at data. It's going to work on data after the data is inserted and after the data is updated. You have other options. You can work with before insert, before update, before delete, or you can work with data after it's inserted, after it's updated, deleted, or undeleted. So far I've talked about one option of where your code lives, and that's in a separate file called a class and not within the actual trigger itself. But you're likely going to see another way that that some developers structure their triggers. And so we should talk about it because you'll probably see it. So you might see that you've got a trigger and instead of linking out to various classes, it's got all of the code that actually is going to run your programmatic business processes inside the trigger itself. And that seems simple, right? Because you have one trigger per object and it contains all the things. So why wouldn't we just do that? It's not best practice because of a variety of reasons. So some of them I've detailed here. One is that it's much easier to reuse code if you have that code that is doing the actual work in a separate file. Because, for example, you may have your code, some of the same actions before and after, or before insert and before update. And so you may have some code that you want to use in multiple places. You're going to reuse it. But if you have that code all in the trigger, then you can't reuse it. You have to put it in all of the places that you want to use it. And that it's not only bad because duplication is generally not a good idea, but also because when you want to update that code and modify it, you have to update it in all the places that you've entered it. So that's why that's not a good idea. It's also easier to read code if it's in smaller chunks. So you have your table of contents, which is your trigger, and then you have all of your classes and methods within them, which make it easier to read and figure out what's going on. Also, you've probably heard of unit tests. And so unit tests are a way to make sure that everything is working in our code is working as planned. And unit tests are required before you deploy any of your code to production. And so it's easier to write distinct unit tests when you're dealing with smaller sections of codes. And while I'm talking about best practices, I mentioned that you should only have one trigger per object. But why is that? It's because it's really the only way you control the order that your code is going to run. So imagine you have two triggers on the same object. Well, unfortunately, sometimes one trigger will run first, and then sometimes another trigger will run first, and you can't control it. So having one trigger per object is optimal. So then you can really control how things are going to run. So in the demo I'm about to do, you're going to see a Cooking with Code custom app, and it stores recipes and their reviews. But how is the data structured? So this is the data model. Each recipe can have more than one review, and each review has a single reviewer, which then is being pulled from the user object. And what is our trigger going to do? Whenever a recipe record is inserted or updated into our org, we want the trigger to check to see if there are any reviews on that recipe. For that, we're going to use a roll-up summary field that counts all the related reviews. And if there are no reviews, then the code will add a review record with some default data, basically a stub, and assign the review to whoever owns the recipe. So that's in words what we're going to do. Again, I'm a visual learner, so I like to present things in graphics. So here we go. And one of the things that you have to take into consideration when you're coding is that you're not just going to have a single user that's going to add a single recipe. Sometimes you're going to be doing bulk updates to your code, to your data, and so you have to deal with that in code. And so let's imagine that you've just uploaded a set of 1,000 new recipes using Data Loader. What happens next? Well, the recipe trigger is listening, and it hears that a change is made, and it stores all of the affected records in a list called trigger.new. But what's a list? A list is just another kind of fancy word for a container or a bucket that stores things and allows you to work on them as a group. We'll see quite a few lists in action today, and our first one, trigger.new, contains all of the records that you just sent to the database. So now trigger.new, all of the records that were just updated and inserted, is sent to a method within a class. And we talked about classes before, but they're just another type of file that stores code outside of a trigger. Well, a method is the section within the code that's actually going to perform some distinct action. So now that the method has the group of records that were just changed, it stores it in its own list called list recipe, and then it takes each one of these recipes out one by one and evaluates them, and this is called looping through the list. And you may be asking, well, why do we need this other list when we have trigger.new? And that's because classes can accept lists like trigger.new, but they can't use them unless they're stored in a list that is within the class itself. So that's why we need this list recipes. It's taking in trigger.new and it's storing it in list recipes. So then we have a section that is going to ask a question of each record. Does the recipe have at least one review on it? If it has no review, then it's going to create one and associate it with the record, set some default data, and then save it into another list called new reviews. Well, that's a lot of buckets. Why do we need so many? Why wouldn't we just save the reviews now, one by one as they're created? Well, we're gonna talk about a thing called bulkification. When you're doing bulk entries in your org, you're going to run up against a thing called governor limits. And these are the limits that Salesforce puts in place to make sure that everybody's being a really good tenant in the cloud. So think about Salesforce as a massive apartment building. And if there were no limits and one big water tank, then one tenant could use up all of the hot water and everyone in the building would get cold showers. So bulkification is a way of working with records as a group and not running into these limits. This is why we need this third list, new reviews, because we don't want to save records one by one, because if we're importing thousands of records, then that's the equivalent of hogging all the water, and Salesforce would stop us from doing that. So instead, we bulkify our code and put all of these new reviews that we just created into a list called new reviews. And we save that list all at once. And the saving, that's done by something called DML. It stands for Data Manipulation Language, which is just a fancy name for the most basic coding language you'll ever write. And it's a way of getting your data into salesforce.org. So I feel like you've been complete troopers, and you've listened to me talk a lot. But now I want to show you this demo. So here we are in our Cooking with Code custom app. And you'll see we have two custom objects, recipes and reviews, and we're using one standard object, which is listed as people, but as we know, that's users behind the scenes. And you can see that if I open up one of these recipes, I'm going to open up coconut ice. You'll see that there's a bunch of information on here, including the number of reviews. And if I go to the related tab, you'll see that there's a bunch of reviews there. And this is nothing really that interesting to you. It's a very simple data model. We've all seen this before. So I'm going to get into the developer console. Now, the developer console is really great because the Salesforce platform provides it to you as just part of your org. And it's available. You click on the gear icon and you select developer console. Make this a bit bigger. So here we have our trigger. And it's exactly what you saw previously with just one line added. So our table of contents has one thing in it. So let's go through this again. So we have a trigger using the word trigger as the keyword, and it's called recipe, and it's listening to the recipe custom object. It's going to fire after insert and after update, which means that it'll fire whenever you add new recipes and whenever you update existing ones, because we didn't have this review object quite yet when we started our recipes. And so there is a bunch of recipes in there that don't have reviews. So that's why we're not just going to create a new review sub on insert, but also on update. And what is it going to do? It's going to go through to the recipe utility class, and it's going to fire the create review method. And it's going to feed that method the trigger.new list, which comes with us. We don't have to create it. It's just something that comes with triggers. And it contains all the records that we just saved to our org. So that's great. Let's now look at the class. And I'm going to just pause for a second because I want to make sure that your screens all catch up so that we're all together. So just like triggers, the first line of our class sets up the type of file. So it says class. And then you name the class, recipe utility. The public piece just defines some security around when we can access this code and who can access it within the org. And everything you see between 2 /, like on line 3, you see 2 / and then some like English it's a sentence, that is a code comment. And when you're looking at your code, you want to see a fair amount of this because it helps describe, it's what we as coders or as people who are reading the code, it describes in plain language what the code is doing and helps save us some time when we want to update the code or figure out what's going wrong, because we can read in plain language what this thing is doing. So you'll see a lot of that in there. Anything with two forward slashes is just a code comment. It's not actually running any code. It's just describing what it does. But let's keep reading. So on line 4, we're creating a method, which you can think of just as a section of the class that does stuff. So all of the things that are doing things are in the method. And we're going to name that method. It's called create review. And again, you'll see public, so that's just defining the security around it. You'll also see this phrase static void. Don't worry about that too much. We're not going to go over that in this webinar, but I can certainly talk to you about it in the Trailblazer community afterwards. And so we have this method. It's called create review, and you can probably guess what it does. It creates reviews for the recipe. So you want to make sure that all of your stuff is named. Naming is hard, but it's really helpful to have things named in a logical way. So everything between the curly braces on the end of line 4 all the way down to line 40, which you can't actually see right now, but the curly braces are sort of like a start and a stop for your code. So you see that the class has a start and a stop, the method has a start and a stop, and it's a way of bookending, okay, everything between these curly braces, this is what this method is. And we could have any number of methods in this class, but right now we only have one. So on line 7, we're creating a variable, and you can think of a variable as just a temporary storage container. It's just going to exist while this code is running. And that's going to store a date. The name of the variable is ddate, which stands for due date, and we're setting it to be today's date. On the next line, on line 8, we're overriding that date and adding 1 month to it. So ddate will now be a month from today. Next, on line 12, we're creating our new reviews list. So this is our storage container that's going to contain all of the new reviews that we're going to create. When you create a list that's going to store a particular type of record, you define the type of record it's going to store. So in this case, you can see that it is going to be storing our custom reviews. Then from lines 15 to 35, I'm just going to scroll this down a little bit. From 15 to 35, you can see that we're taking each recipe and we're looping over it, analyzing it. And depending on what we find with each of these recipes, we're going to do something. So on line 19, you'll see an if statement. And if you've ever created, you probably all have created a formula field or a validation rule that contained an if statement. This is the same thing. It's just asking a question. In this case, it's looking at the number of reviews roll-up summary field and looking at it and saying, is it less than 1 for the particular recipe that we're looking at? If it is, then we'll do everything between the next set of curly braces, so that's line 20 to 34. And what we're doing is we're creating a new review. So if there isn't a review already, we're going to create a new review, and again, we're going to store it in a variable, a container called myRev. And we're setting some default values there. So the first thing we're doing is we're naming the review, and we're going to concatenate or just add together, string together some text that is a review of, and then a space, and then the name of the review. We're also setting the status to not started. We're setting the due date to the value of the date variable that we defined above, ddate. We're relating the recipe that's being assessed. So we're tying the review to the recipe that we were just analyzing, and we're setting the reviewer to whoever owns the recipe. We could do all manner of things here, but just to keep it simple, this is what we're doing. On the next line, 32, we're adding a review record to all of our new reviews list. And while I'm talking about loops, loops are really great because they come with some built-in standard functionality. So this type of loop is going to look to see if there are any recipes left in our list, and then for us to loop over. And if there are, it's just going to keep pulling out each recipe from the list and doing the same analysis on it. And then it's going to look, and when it reaches the end of the list, there are no more recipes in it, then it's just going to stop and move on. So that's built-in functionality that comes with a loop. And at this point, we have a list of new reviews that are just waiting to be saved to our Salesforce org. We have this list because we don't want to save records one by one, because after a certain number of reviews that are added, Salesforce is going to say, you're a bad tenant, you're using up all the water, you're shut off. So that's why we're bulkifying our code and using this list to contain all of our new reviews and save that in one fell swoop up to Salesforce. And I want you to look at line 38. This is this language, this data manipulation language, or DML. It's pretty simple. It's insert new reviews. And what it does is it takes this list of new reviews and it sends it up to the cloud and inserts these reviews into our org. So it's pretty easy. So I just want to pause and say, this isn't as scary as it might. I mean, you could look at this code and you could say, oh my God, I don't know what I'm looking at. But as we go through it bit by bit, you can probably figure out what this does, especially if things are named well and they're laid out, good. Then, just take your time and try and read the triggers in your org. So that's what I would recommend you're doing. But so this is the code, but let's look at this in action. So first of all, I'm going to go to Pavlova. So Pavlova has one review. So we're going to save. We're going to make a change to this. Maybe I'll change this from easy to medium, and I'm going to say that there is one review here already, so it should not create another review. There should only still be one review. So I'm going to save it, and there it is, one review. So let's go back, and we're going to find a recipe that doesn't have anything, and that is shortbread. So shortbread has no reviews. Look, I'm showing you up my arms. There's no magic going on, no reviews. And I'm going to, again, edit this. Maybe I'll attribute it to somebody. Let's attribute it to Sandita. I'm going to save the record. And here I have one review. If I go in and have a look at the review, you'll see that it contains all of the default data that we set up. So it's review of shortbread, I am the reviewer, the status is not started, and the due date is a month from today. So I better get on that. Luckily, I love making shortbread, so it's all good. So that's pretty much the magic. So let's look at what we saw today. So we learned that triggers and classes are just types of files that contain code, that methods live within classes and contain the code that does all the things, that triggers can work on records before and after you save your data in your org. And we talked about different coding concepts like variables, lists, loops, and if statements. And we talked about some best practice, including one trigger per object, use code comments, put all your code that does all the things in a class, and then point to that, use the trigger as a table of contents, and don't use all the hot water up and bulkify your code. So we have some resources. You can look at these at your leisure, womencodeheroes.com, sfdc99.com. If you're a woman who's an advanced admin, check out the free coding course at redwomen.org. And I've given you some starter trails or badges to do within Trailhead. So Mark, over to you.
Karen, that was fantastic. So I know there are a number of questions that have been posted in the admin webinar group. Unfortunately, we're just about at time today, so we will answer those questions in the group. There's going to be a survey that pops up after this. Please let us know what you thought of today's content. We really do value your feedback. And the slides will be posted at the bit.ly URL there, and of course will also be in the admin webinar group. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We hope you found the content valuable, and huge thanks to Kieran, who adapted her Dreamforce session for this fantastic webinar. Thanks everyone, have a great day.